Consumers want to know the facts about the products they buy, but America's agricultural landscape is not easy to navigate. Between different companies, scientific advancement, government regulations, advertisement campaigns, and an unhealthy amount of myth and misconception, anyone would be hard-pressed to make sense of it. That's where Real Ag comes in. From the producers who make your food, to the store where you buy the final product, and everything in between. This is Real Ag. Now, here's your host, Kyle Bauer.
We've all driven by a wheat field and watched it grow over time until harvest. Then a year later, that same field has sorghum or is fallow. Why are crops rotated and what are the benefits? Crop rotation is the topic today on Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
the Kansas Soybean Commission, the Soybean Checkoff, progress powered by farmers.
Why is crop rotation necessary?
Crop rotation means you're not planting the same crop every year. So continuous wheat, continuous corn, that is not crop rotation. Crop rotation is planting multiple crops across different years. Crop rotation is necessary agronomically because it helps control disease, insects, it reduces weed pressure, it improves soil health. So if you plant the same crop, say continuous wheat year after year after year, that wheat is food for disease and insects. And so you start to build those populations to a point where they can reduce yield. So as you introduce other crops, then you reduce those populations so that they don't reduce yield, or you don't have to buy inputs to control them. And so by rotating, you actually increase your yield and decrease your dependency on inputs.
Crop rotation serves a number of roles. In many ways, it doesn't matter what else is going on in the system, but if you're rotating the crops, you can break up disease cycles. So if you've got the same crop in the field every year, some diseases reside in the crop residues or in the soil. And so that pest or that pathogen is present, and its host plant will be there every year, and it just builds up over time. Soybean cyst nematode is a good example of this. You plant susceptible soybean varieties in a field year after year, this nematode builds to levels that will severely impact production. And so rotating away from soybeans allows those nematode numbers to drop. You can come back to soybeans in a year or two or three and have successful production. Same thing applies to some insects, things like that. Crop rotation is very important when we think about our no-till systems, where we're not tilling the ground either ever or very infrequently. Because in those systems, one of the reasons anyway, is because there you have the residue on the surface. You're not burying the residue, and so those pests can survive even easier. And so it's more important to rotate to different crops or different types of crops. Weed management is very important for crop rotation. And it becomes important for mixing up different crops. I've mentioned types of crops. So you've got winter crops like winter wheat, winter canola is another option in some parts of the state. If you can have a couple of years of a winter crop, then go back to a couple of years of a summer crop like soybeans or corn or sorghum. You affect the weed seed population so that the seed bank that's in the soil, you're away from the summer crop that it would thrive in by rotating to the winter annual crop. By the time you get back to the summer crop, that seed bank has been depleted enough that you have fewer weed issues to deal with.
Farmers don't typically want to plant the same crop year after year after year because it lends itself to disease developing in that field that is specific to one crop. So a farmer in western Kansas, for example, may plant wheat in a field one year and follow that the next year with grain sorghum or milo, because two completely different crops have different disease issues and disease problems. So that's called a rotation. In western Kansas, where it's really dry, a farmer may grow wheat 2 years in a row and then do what's called fallow, where they leave the field empty for a year and for the soil moisture to collect, and then they might go back to wheat another year.
Typically in Kansas, you're going to see a rotation that probably involves winter wheat, corn, milo, and soybeans, possibly sunflowers, and then cover crops will be probably planted in between fallow periods. So growing up, we were probably pretty much continuous wheat with a little bit of milo, and then over time, so where we are now would be we plant winter wheat 2 years in a row, then corn, milo, and 2 years of soybeans, and then in fallow, and rather than letting the ground sit fallow, we will plant cover crops to increase more diversity, because part of what crop rotation is introducing diversity back into farming.
How does the farmer know when to rotate?
You can start at any point in time with a rotation. If something has been continuously in wheat or in a very simple rotation of, say, wheat milo, you want to rotate into a different crop. You don't want to, and that's, I guess, should be fairly self-explanatory in the fact that you're not going to be, well, you wouldn't want to go back to a crop that's very similar. Say, if you're planting winter wheat, you don't want to go to rye or spring wheat. You want to rotate to something that is different than the crops before.
You can do soil tests and do nematode egg counts or cyst counts in those soils, and you can decide whether you have a real issue or not. Many diseases, it's very difficult. You can maybe detect the presence of the disease, but it's hard to predict whether that's going to, what the relationship between that and the severity of that disease is going to be. And so it's more or less a situation where you rely on past experience to know, or research data. And that's a lot of what I do, is research various rotations and the ways we manage our crop. To know that, okay, if you follow corn after corn after corn, these are issues you'll be running to. And it's not necessarily crop failure, but it's just a negative impact on the corn, say, and it gradually can decrease.
If you were to use a certain chemical on wheat and try to plant soybeans in that same field afterwards, there may be a chemical problem the soybeans might not be able to tolerate. So those are some things you have to keep in mind. Mostly it's about the life cycle of the plant. Timing of when the wheat is harvested and when you can plant another plant. And depending upon different parts of the state of Kansas is so varied from east to west in terms of climate. That is the biggest factor in what a farmer will use in their crop rotation.
And so over time, a number of rotations have developed as just standard good practice. A lot of it's driven by available markets and what's well suited to that environment. And so you look at the Corn Belt, Iowa, Illinois, Ohio, etc. Huge acreages of corn, and followed by soybean, followed by corn. And so yes, it's a rotation. And it's been very successful over time, but it has its own problems because you're only talking about 2 crops, and so it's a very short-term rotation, and they're both summer crops, and so some of these weed issues that we talked about, you're not addressing all that well. And in recent years, both of those crops have been glyphosate-tolerant crops. The same method of herbicides been used on both crops. And so now we have developed weed-resistant populations. And so the importance of having either more diverse rotations or diverse herbicide use out there, not relying too much on one herbicide, people are realizing the importance of those things. And so you look at past experience, there's a lot of data and experience that would indicate that the more diverse, the more different types of crops, the more different crops you can include in a rotation, the next time you get back to the crop, the longer period of time between a single crop, the better it generally will perform when you do grow it. And so very complex rotations are common in parts of the country where we have the ability to both grow several different crops, but also then market the crops, because that becomes part of the issue. You can grow a lot of different things, but if you can't sell it, it's hard to justify.
If the price of wheat goes down, they're less likely to plant more wheat acres because the price is low. If the price goes high, they're more likely to plant more wheat acres, but they still have to fit that within their rotation. And that's not something they can just change on a dime.
There are certain principles that come into play. Obviously shifting, like if you've got we mentioned the summer and winter issue, right? And so shifting away from a summer crop to a winter crop, at least every couple of years, is a good principle to follow. Another principle would be shifting or rotating from a grass crop like corn or sorghum to a broadleaf crop like soybeans or canola, sunflowers, those kinds of things. And because they have typically different sets of diseases, different nutrient requirements, those kinds of things. Another principle would be involving legumes. And legumes, soybeans is probably the most common legume crop we grow. Alfalfa is a very common legume crop. They fix their own nitrogen from the atmosphere, so you don't need to apply nitrogen fertilizer. They require other fertilizers, phosphorus, potassium in some cases.
So in a corn-soybean rotation, the soybeans will leave some residue, some leftover nitrogen from their production in the soil, which could be used with the corn crop the next year, so which helps cut some of your input costs to raise corn or even to raise wheat if you're in a wheat-soybean rotation. We've done some second-year soybeans, but I don't really want to use third. Go 3 years or more continuous. Same way with corn, we'll go 3 or 4 years on corn, but to break the disease cycle and the insect cycle, same way with soybeans, you can build up some diseases or some insect problems by continuous cropping. So to rotate that is always good practice, whether it's an every other year rotation or a 2-year rotation. Everybody has a different rotation that works for them, or if you raise some wheat, to have a wheat in that rotation. But mainly it's to break disease cycles and insect cycles. Plus soybeans have a really deep, long taproot, which also helps break up some compaction in deeper layers of soil and some water penetration down when that big taproot rots away. Why, that's a channel for nutrients to go down into the subsoil.
So these plants produce some chemicals in their plant material, leaves typically, seeds sometimes, that have a negative, often effect on other crops. And so one example would be things like some of the brassica crops, canola. We grow some radishes as cover crops in our systems that release these chemicals into the environment that actually suppress in the growing crop, and also for some period after that crop has died and been harvested, it'll do some suppression of other species, or say other weed species that may come into that field.
How does no-till farming relate to crop rotation?
Crop rotation can involve fields not being worked for long periods of time. Typically within a tillage system, you don't see as much crop rotation because tillage destroys the residue which harbors the disease and insects. The problem with tillage is it also destroys soil, it causes erosion, which destroys water quality and air quality. So in a no-till system where you eliminate the tillage and so that tool is not available to you anymore, you have to use crop rotation to reduce the disease and the insects that you were reducing through tillage. Disease and insects are always going to be out there. What you're trying to accomplish is to reduce their presence to a point where it's not affecting yield. Our human bodies are always being bombarded with sickness, but our immune system is able to fight that off. Essentially, that's what we're trying to do here, is not let that disease or insects get to a point where it causes the crop poor health. Like I said, on our farm, it's wheat, corn, milo, bean. It will vary. We will vary that depending on if for whatever reason we're having a weed issue or a disease or insect problem. In the first crop, say in the first year wheat, we have cheat. We're not going to go back to wheat the second year because we know we already have a problem. And so we will vary it depending on the circumstances. If you're using a crop rotation with no-till, it will have a positive environmental impact because you're going to improve soil health, you're going to eliminate or nearly eliminate erosion to the point where you're not destroying water quality, you're not destroying air quality when the wind picks up the soil particles. And then all the downstream effects of that, of you're not going to be silting in your reservoirs and all the other issues.
As you move to no-till and higher residue situations, that just the crop that you don't harvest, leave it behind on the soil surface, that's when rotation becomes important for no-till to be successful. And over time, there's been a lot of experience and research information that would support the fact that the more diverse your rotation, the more different crops that you can introduce into that field over a period of years, the more success you're going to have in terms of productivity, efficiency of water use, those kinds of things. And so very often diverse crop rotations, and by that I just mean rotations with lots of different crops and crop types, are very key and important for no-till systems to be successful. Crop rotation has a very long history. There are records from Roman historians that talk about the importance of including legumes in their crop rotations that were pretty heavily wheat-based or other small grains, rye, those kinds of things. And so they saw the value of including a legume in those rotations even back then. And so historically, it's been very important. From time to time, though, there are reasons why certain systems have moved away from rotation. The cotton production system in southeast U.S. back in, actually for many years, was cotton every year because that was the highest value crop, and even though there would be benefits to rotating, those benefits didn't necessarily outweigh the economic return they could get of growing cotton again. Even now, there are systems like in our irrigated systems, it's pretty difficult to rotate away from corn because corn is so responsive to added water. And we can overcome a lot of the limitations or the problems associated with not rotating with other technology. We can add fertilizer. We can apply fungicides to control some of the diseases that get to be an issue. We can do some tillage to handle the residue, or strip tillage or things like that. And so sometimes the economics push it to less rotation over time, perhaps.
How does crop rotation vary from state to state?
Oh, it's very, very different. In terms of, we mentioned earlier in the Corn Belt, corn and soybeans are heavily predominant. As you move to the eastern Corn Belt, southern Corn Belt, there actually may be more wheat in certain areas, but I know big pieces of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, there's very little besides corn and soybeans. And talking to some of my colleagues, and when they've talked about diversifying and changing up their rotations, it's more like, well, how about 2 years of corn and then a year of soybeans? Instead of corn and soybeans, they're alternating. And so that's probably one of the most consistent rotations that's out there. But as we move into Kansas, that's pretty common now in the eastern third, even eastern half of the state, is corn, soybeans are very common. There are a lot of reasons for that. But as we move west, we can't support that just largely because of moisture resource. So wheat becomes much more and more important west as we move west and south. As you move south, canola introduces into the picture. And so, as we mentioned earlier, the rainfall, soil resource, and then the heat temperature regime and growing season. And so as you move north, you've got shorter growing seasons but longer days, and that has an impact on their rotations. And if you talk to people in the North Dakota, they often have like 30 different crops that they're working in from time to time. Not every year, but they're available to them. And their infrastructure has developed to support the markets and things like that. And that's a big piece of what limits rotations. We've been working for many years to introduce canola into the Great Plains. Many reasons. We feel it's a very good addition to our rotations to move away from continuous wheat, either whether it's got fallow or not. And as you move into historical wheat country in south central Kansas and into Oklahoma, it was wheat every year for a lot of reasons. And introducing canola into that system has proven very beneficial in terms of weed control, wheat yields, disease issues, those kinds of things. And so canola has found a nice niche in those areas, but it's hard to move winter canola much north of I-70, say. It's had some success, but it's just less winter hardy than wheat in many ways. And so then you need to move to spring canola, and that's really more successful even further north. And so just the characteristics of the crops that are available relative to the environmental conditions that you have, and combine that with the available market. So as we've introduced canola, we could overcome a lot of the agronomic issues, but we had to work with industry and the processors to develop marketing points and just the logistics of having places for farmers to go with the canola that they produced. And that's true for diversifying and increasing the number of crops in any situation. I think we as producers need to be attentive to what are consumers looking for. And so that's one of the reasons why canola has been so appealing. Is it's one of its main products, what really drives its market is healthy vegetable oil. And so that's been a big consumer demand for years. And nationally, we've been importing canola oil or canola seed to crush for oil for years. And so our domestic production has nowhere near met our domestic demand. Hence, we said that's a good option for us in the Great Plains. It has all the agronomic things, or many of the agronomic things we're looking for in terms of the rotational benefits. There's also the demand. So we don't have to convince the consumers that this is something new that they should try. And so I think that's the best case scenario, to where you identify crops that already have either an established demand, or it's very easy to identify the niche that they would fill in terms of the potential market.
It's an essential part of, or should be an essential part of, all farming practices. It's beneficial to not only the farmer but also society.
Crop rotation is just a very important part of our crop production systems, I think, in today's very connected economy and the environment we live in. I think it's got a lot of benefits from a production side for the farmers in terms of the benefits they can see in terms of disease management and insect management, but also just their yields and potentially profits. I think there are a lot of benefits they can see. It also has benefits environmentally in terms of nutrient cycling, keeping nutrients and applied nutrients, whether it's from manures or fertilizers, in the field and not running off or entering streams and those kinds of things. Crop rotation can play an important role in that regard. We talked already about the risk management from the producer side, but there's also risk management in terms of the processing side, so that it diversifies the sources of these various feed or food or fiber inputs for the system, and so it's grown across a wider range of environments, and it's buffered against environmental variation, drought, floods, these kinds of things.
Well, that wraps up this episode of Real Ag. Remember, you can see every program of this series by going to smokyhillstv.org. Until next time, I'm Kyle Bauer, and this has been Real Ag.
Production of Real Ag is made possible by
The Kansas Soybean Commission. The Soybean Checkoff. Progress powered by farmers.